If you found this reader's guide helpful, please consider pledging your support to Voice of Geekdom on Patreon and gain access to premium content. Last time on the Silmarillion Explained, we read about the early civilizations of the men who first arrived in Beleriand, the three houses of the Edain, as they were known, and the heroes of those houses who forged the early legends of mankind. We covered the deliberations of the men in the settlements at Estolad, as they debated over whether to ally themselves with the Eldar in their war against Morgoth. They later realised that Amlach, one of the men of the House of Marak, who spoke at the meeting, was an impostor sent by Morgoth to sow dissent. We also covered the story of Haleth, who took over leadership of the Haladin under desperate circumstances after her father was killed defending their people from an orc raid. She later led the Haladin to the forest of Brethil, where she made a deal with Thingol to occupy that land and defend the River Taglian from the forces of Morgoth. Finally, we were introduced to Hador the Golden-Haired, descendant of Marak, who was granted the realm of Dor-Lomin by High King Fingolfin, thus establishing the House of Hador, from which came many of the greatest of the elf friends. Hello Tolkien geeks! Chapter 18 is a pivotal one. The moment in which the Siege of Angband, a period of history which we've been discussing for some time now, is finally broken by Morgoth. The chapter begins by telling us that Fingolfin had decided to advocate for and prepare an assault on Angband. Morgoth had been boxed in for nearly 4 centuries and was free to build up his strength in the underworld. Fingolfin knew that eventually Morgoth would attack, and he judged that any further delay would cost the elves everything. The narrative, however, takes the view that any assault against Angband would have failed, no matter when it happened. Fingolfin's intent to attack Angband was wise according to the measure of his knowledge, for the Noldor did not yet comprehend the fullness of the power of Morgoth, nor understand that their unaided war upon him was without final hope, whether they hasted or delayed. If we cast our minds back a few chapters, this wasn't the first time that we were told that Angband would not and could not be defeated by the Noldor. Feanor had a premonition of exactly that fact right before his death in chapter 13. Fingolfin was right to assume that the peace wouldn't last, and couldn't have known at this point that Morgoth's strength was unassailable. The Silmarillion narrator, as we know, takes a historical perspective on the events of the Wars of Beleriand, and speaks with the benefit of hindsight. And the narrator also knows the story of the Ainur-Lindalei, which indicates that the events of history proceed according to the music of the Ainur, as planned by Eru Ilúvatar. The implication here is that aid must come to the Noldor from somewhere, and we can more or less place trust in it whenever the narrative draws this kind of value judgment about history, according to the internal rules that the frame of the text gives to us. The other problem that Fingolfin had was that the various peoples of the Noldor were content and complacent after a long period of relative peace. Only Angrod and Aignor, that's Finrod's younger brothers, were persuaded by Fingolfin's argument. These two were located closest to Thangorodrim in Dorthonion, and thus motivated by their proximity to the front lines of the siege. What may seem a little surprising here is the reaction of the sons of Feanor. The Noldor were little disposed to hearken to Fingolfin, and the sons of Feanor, at that time, least of all. The Oath of Feanor, which his sons all took together in the city of Tirion back in chapter 9, demanded that they pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world any who should keep a Silmaril from their possession. And yet they seem content to leave Morgoth alone here, as long as he remains within the Liga. This will change later on, and yet there will never be a better time than this for the Noldor to attack. I think there are two main reasons for the Sons of Feanor's lack of urgency to fulfill the terms of their oath, but I'd be interested to read what you all think about this in the comments, whether you've read the Silmarillion before or not. I think, firstly, the Sons of Feanor were afraid of others being involved in the fight to take back the Silmarils, especially Fingolfin, whom we know had an enormously complicated relationship with his half-brother before he died. If their uncle, the High King, led a successful assault on Angband, his house may attempt to claim the Silmarils as their own. In this eventuality, the sons would be compelled by their oath to attack whomever held them, causing a civil war amongst all of the Noldor. An attack led by Maedhros rather than by Fingolfin might be more favourable to them. But there was also self-interest at work here, and the Sons of Feanor had a bountiful reign in Beleriand in their various realms in the northeast of your Silmarillion map. Because the land was fair and their kingdoms wide, most of the Noldor were content with things as they were, trusting them to last, and slow to begin an assault in which many must surely perish, were it in victory or in defeat. We've heard previously about Caranthia's comfortable and profitable arrangement with the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. The Sons of Feanor, and the princes of the Noldor in general, weren't immune to a degree of avarice. In the year 455 of the First Age of the Sun, the vengeance of Angband came suddenly, unexpectedly in the night. There came a time of winter, when night was dark and without moon, and the wide plain of Ardgallen stretched dim beneath the cold stars, from the hill forts of the Noldor to the feet of Thangorodrim. The watchfires burned low, and the guards were few. On the plain few were waking in the camps of the horsemen of Hithlum. Then suddenly Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down swifter than Balrogs from Thangorodrim, and poured over all the plain, and the mountains of iron belched forth fires of many poisonous hues, and the fume of them stank upon the air, and was deadly. Thus Ardgallen perished, and fire devoured its grasses, and it became a burned and desolate waste, full of a choking dust, barren and lifeless. Thereafter its name was changed, and it was called Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Many charred bones had there their roofless grave, for many of the Noldor perished in that burning, who were caught by the running flame, and could not fly to the hills. The heights of Dorthonion and Eredwethrin held back the fiery torrents, but their woods upon the slopes that looked towards Angband were all kindled, and the smoke wrought confusion among the defenders. Thus began the fourth of the great battles, Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. The imagery of this scene is really striking and vivid. A dark, moonless night. The wide, dim plain under the cold stars, the watchfires burning low. The sudden violence of the scene is made more stark and visceral by the tranquil description of this verdant, peaceful land before it was abruptly ruined. I really enjoy the name change of the plain of Ardgallen. It reminds you of the utter destruction of the lands of the north every time the name is mentioned from here onward. Anfauglith, the gasping dust. One of Professor Tolkien's foremost goals and interests with the invention of his original languages was in the aesthetic verbal component of the language. Elvish was supposed to sound beautiful and evocative, or, when appropriate, horrifying and visceral. The change of name from the green region of Ardgallen to the gasping dust of Anfauglith does quite a lot of the legwork of describing this dramatic blighting of the lands around Thangorodrim, without requiring the kind of lengthy landscape description for which The Lord of the Rings is so well known. If you remember back to chapter 14, the geography chapter, and recall my coverage of that chapter, Events like this are partly why I spoke of the value of engaging in the Elvish nomenclature and taking in some of the flavour of the corpus of the language. It's something that grows in the mind of Silmarillion readers with subsequent rereads. Let's read onward. In the front of that fire came Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons, in his full might, and in his train were Balrogs, and behind them came the black armies of the Orcs, in multitudes such as the Noldor had never before seen or imagined. And they assaulted the fortresses of the Noldor, and broke the leaguer about Angband, and slew wherever they found them the Noldor and their allies, grey elves and men. Many of the stoutest of the foes of Morgoth were destroyed in the first days of that war, bewildered and dispersed, and unable to muster their strength. War ceased not wholly ever again in Beleriand, but the Battle of Sudden Flame is held to have ended with the coming of spring, when the onslaught of Morgoth grew less. We last heard of Glaurung, the father of dragons, when he was still young and underdeveloped, at the end of chapter 13, when he was driven off by Fingon in his premature state. Glaurung was one of the foremost lieutenants of Morgoth in the Wars of Beleriand, perhaps roughly equal in status to Sauron and Gothmog. Glaurung was a large, fire-breathing but flightless dragon. He was intelligent and, like all dragons, had the power of speech, as well as other stranger powers, which will come into the story later on. A dragon is not only a weapon of mass destruction, but also a type of psychological warfare. Morgoth wanted to terrify the elves with his newest servant, as well as obliterate their defences and decimate their forces. In the aftermath of the Dagor Bragollach, many of the Sindar living in the northern realms of the Noldor, in Hithlum and Dorthonion particularly, retreated to the lands further south, and many of them ended up relocating to Thingol's realm of Doriath, which was strengthened by the greater numbers and the superior arms of the Grey Elves, who had dwelt for many years with the more skilled craftspeople of the Noldor. Many others took refuge instead in Nargothrond, perhaps those who withdrew from Dorthonion, the lands of Angrod and Aegnor, both of whom were slain in the onslaught. This would make the most sense if they wished to continue to follow the Noldor. Finrod still ruled in Nargothrond at that time, and the city was hidden and well guarded. Others still fled as far south as Osiriand, and even across the mountains and into the east, where news of Morgoth's swift victory spread far and wide. After counting the deaths of Angrod and Aegnor, and of Bragollach, who was the current lord of the House of Beor, the next passage concerns Finrod Felagund. Barahir, the brother of Bragollach, was in the fighting further westward, near to the pass of Sirion. There King Finrod Felagund, hastening from the south, was cut off from his people and surrounded with small company in the fen of Serek, and he would have been slain or taken. But Barahir came up with the bravest of his men and rescued him, and made a wall of spears about him, and they cut their way out of the battle with great loss. Thus Felagund escaped, and returned to his deep fortress of Nargothrond, but he swore an oath of abiding friendship and aid in every need to Barahir and all his kin, and in token of his vow he gave to Barahir his ring. Barahir was now by right lord of the House of Beor, and he returned to Dorthonion, but most of his people fled from their homes and took refuge in the fastness of Hithlum. You may remember back to the closing paragraphs of chapter 15, when Finrod spoke to Galadriel, his sister, concerning his lack of family connections, and he replied to her, "An oath I too shall swear, and must be free to fulfill it, and go into darkness." This oath that Finrod swears to Barahir here was the very oath that this earlier passage had referred to. Take note of this, as this moment, as well as Barahir himself, will be important in the next chapter. The Ring of Barahir shows up again in The Lord of the Rings, on the finger of Aragorn of all places, over 6.5 millennia later. This was depicted in the Peter Jackson films, and remarked upon by Christopher Lee's Saruman.
He bore a strange ring, 2 serpents with emerald eyes, one devouring, the other crowned with golden flowers.
The Ring of Barahir.
Also on the list of casualties was Hador Lorindol, Lord of Dor-Lomin, whom we were introduced to in the previous chapter. Hador was killed defending the rearguard of High King Fingolfin, valiantly covering his lord's retreat as the orcs assailed the fortress at Aethel Sirion. Although Barad Aethel and the other fortresses along the eastern side of the Shadowy Mountains were overrun, the mountains formed a natural barrier against the attack, which meant that the land of Hithlum itself was protected against a full-scale invasion. The Sons of Feanor lost much of their territory, however, as the assault focused on the eastern flank of the siege lines. Although all 7 sons survived, the Gap of Maglor was overrun, and Glaurung himself passed through it. Orcs then followed him through, and began raiding and marauding through the lands of East Beleriand. Caranthir's country in Thargelion was invaded and occupied, and he fled into the south, joining forces with the twins Amrod and Amras, the 2 youngest sons. Curafin and Celegorm retreated to Finrod's Nargothrond, remaining there as guests. We will see them show up there in the very next chapter, as they play a role in that story. The fortress at Himring held, however, and Maglor himself joined his brother Maedhros there. Maedhros won great renown for his feats in battle. The description of his rage in the fighting is well worth quoting. The orcs fled before his face, for since his torment upon Thangorodrim, his spirit burned like a white fire within, and he was as one that returns from the dead. Putting aside the overall awesomeness of this imagery, you may also remember that Maedhros lost his hand during his rescue and escape in Chapter 13, and that he lived to wield his sword with left hand more deadly than his right had been. No doubt the loss of his hand, amidst all his other torments, motivated his battle rage still further. There was an essay of Tolkien's from 1968 that was published in The Nature of Middle-earth recently that indirectly touched on this issue. No distinction was felt between right and left by the Eldar. There was nothing queer, ill-omened, sinister, weak or inferior about the left, nor anything more correct and proper, right, of good omen or honour about right. The Eldar were ambidexters, and the allocation of different habitual services or duties to the right or the left was a purely individual and personal matter, undirected by any general inherited racial habit. The Eldar have been referred to as alike to the concept of an unfallen man. According to this piece of lore, Tolkien's estimation of such a concept apparently did not include the genetic tendency to favour either one hand or the other. Human history is, of course, rife with persecution of left-handed people in many cultures, but this idea about the elves seems to undermine such superstitions. This idea also justifies and explains the ease with which Maedhros was able to teach himself to fight with his left hand. Maedhros is no Jaime Lannister. His left wasn't his offhand originally, his right was apparently simply his chosen hand. Maedhros' character arc is continuing to develop. In Chapter 13, after his rescue by Fingon, he abdicated and the High Kingship passed to Fingolfin. Despite this, he continues to demonstrate his leadership qualities. We've seen his diplomatic nous, witnessed his strength in leading his brothers, and now we see his bravery and his skill in warfare. Maedhros could have been the king, and might have claimed it under different circumstances. In fact, Maedhros' willingness to give up power by itself might be another aspect which points towards his suitability to rule. It's a recurrent theme in Tolkien's Legendarium that those who seek out power often are the last people who should be entrusted with it, and those who give up or refuse power often prove their fitness to lead by doing so. Next time we will continue our coverage of Chapter 18 with the duel of Fingolfin and Morgoth.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe Tier Patreon supporters: Erin M, Stephen Stark the Maya from Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Alexander Petrov, Joshua Boniface, and our newest axe wielder, A.N. Kreutzberg.